Technology may have been miseducated, but you do not have to be. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Miseducation of Technology podcast. I'm your host, Danielle, an attorney and tech policy professional, and someone who is deeply passionate about helping the Black community understand how technology is shaping our lives. And today, I want to start this episode by going back a few months to someone that doesn't sound like they are necessarily related to artificial intelligence, but they absolutely are in this context. And that's singer and songwriter SZA. Now, SZA is someone not typically associated with AI policy conversations. But in July 2025, SZA tweeted about AI data centers, raising questions about their environmental impact, their energy use, and why they seem to keep showing up near certain communities. She wrote, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly here, and I quote, "Please Google how much energy and pollution it takes to run AI. Please Google the beautiful Black cities like Memphis that are suffering because of new AI systems. Please just Google environmental racism. There is a price for convenience, and Black and brown people will pay the brunt of it every time." End quote. And I thought this was interesting because here you have an R&B singer who captured something that Black communities were already living with but hadn't yet been seen reflected in mainstream conversations about artificial intelligence. Because when most people think about AI, they imagine software, algorithms, or something abstract living in the cloud. But for many Black communities across this country, AI is no longer theoretical. It's physical. And it's increasingly showing up next door in the form of massive data centers that demand enormous amounts of electricity, water, and land, often in communities that had little say in whether these data centers arrived at all. Now, fast forward to January of 2026. After months of growing resistance around these AI data centers, Microsoft announced what it called a community-first approach to AI data centers. The company pledged that its facilities would not raise local utility bills, that it would work with utilities to expand rather than strain power grids, reduce and replenish water use, invest in local workforce training and AI education, and stop asking communities for property tax breaks. So on paper, it sounds like progress, right? But announcements like this don't come out of thin air. They come as a result of pressure. When communities start asking hard questions about who pays for innovation and who actually benefits from it. And that's why today's conversation matters. Black communities need to understand what these facilities actually do, how they affect daily life, and why they're being built in our communities. And it's also very important to understand why Microsoft made this announcement, specifically what forced it and why now. These questions are just as important as understanding the actual impact of AI data centers themselves. So in this episode, we're going to explore the issues of AI data centers in 4 distinct parts. Number 1, what are AI data centers? And why does AI require this massive physical infrastructure? Number 2, how do these facilities impact Black communities economically, environmentally, and politically? Number 3, we'll examine the Microsoft Community First announcement, why they made it, and what it does and does not solve. And finally, number 4, we'll talk about what Black communities can do right now to protect themselves and demand real accountability. So without further ado, let's get into it. Part 1, what are AI data centers? At its core, a data center is a large-scale operation designed to process, store, and move data continuously without interruption. Inside these facilities are tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of servers running around the clock. These systems are designed for constant operation. While individual components may be serviced, the infrastructure itself simply cannot power down without significant cost and disruption. To put that in context, a single hyperscale data center can span the equivalent of multiple football fields and consume as much electricity as a mid-sized city. These facilities are built to never go dark because even seconds of downtime can mean millions of dollars in losses. What makes AI data centers different from traditional data centers is not their basic function, it's their intensity. Artificial intelligence systems, particularly large scale and generative AI models, require orders of magnitude more computing power than earlier software systems. Training a modern AI model means running billions or trillions of calculations in parallel, nonstop, often for weeks or months at a time. For example, training large language models like the ones powering chatbots, image generators, or voice assistants require thousands of specialized processors, such as GPUs, running continuously under extreme load. And the demand doesn't stop once the model is trained. Every time someone asks an AI system a question, generates an image, or uses an AI powered feature in an app, that request is processed in real time by servers housed in these data centers. When millions of users interact with AI tools simultaneously, the system must deliver instant responses, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without interruption. And that level of demand has real consequences. It drives enormous electricity demand, generates extreme heat, and requires industrial scale cooling systems, and often relying on millions of gallons of water each year just to keep servers from overheating. In other words, these are not just digital systems. They are physical, resource intensive operations tied directly to land, power grids, and water systems in the communities where these facilities are built. And once a data center is operating, those demands are locked in to the community. So communities don't get to renegotiate electricity use during heat waves. They don't get to pause water consumption during droughts. The infrastructure becomes permanent, while the costs continue to accumulate locally, even as the benefits often flow elsewhere. So understanding what AI data centers actually are is essential because it makes one thing clear. These facilities are not just supporting the AI tools people use every day. They are extracting value from physical communities to power digital systems elsewhere. And that reality sets the stage for the next question. Who is being asked to absorb those costs and why? Part 2, where AI data centers land and the cost associated. If history teaches us anything, it's that major infrastructure projects in the United States have rarely been distributed equally. Highways, power plants, chemical plants, landfills, and industrial corridors have long been placed where land is cheap and political resistance is the weakest. And too often, that has meant Black communities. And AI data centers are following that very same pattern. Across the South and beyond, massive data centers are being proposed or built in predominantly Black or low-income regions, often without transparency, community engagement, or guarantees of long-term benefit. For example, in South Memphis, near a historically Black neighborhood known as Boxtown, residents have been raising alarms about the environmental health impacts since XAI, which is essentially Elon Musk's AI company, began construction of what is described as the world's largest AI data center. Critics, including local residents like 76-year-old Easter Knox, report worsened air quality, describing persistent smog, odors, and respiratory issues like asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease among community members. Some residents say they can't open their windows anymore because of the smell and the pollution in the air. That facility also has enormous resource demands. It consumes tens of thousands of gallons of water per day from the Memphis Sand Aquifer, a crucial local water supply, and requires power that at times outstrips what the local grid was originally designed to support. Community advocates and environmental justice groups have pointed out that Memphis already suffers from legacy pollution and poor health outcomes, and adding a mega data center to that landscape feels like reinforcing a long legacy of environmental racism, not reversing it. But it doesn't stop there. Let's look at the state of Georgia. In South Fulton, Georgia, Black residents and advocates have been vocal about data center proposals moving forward with minimal transparency and meaningful community input. One local organizer described the pattern bluntly, saying, the city needs to think about the history of the environmental racism because it plays a role here. Critics have pushed back against planners who prioritize corporate development at the expense of community voice and long-term well-being. There's also PG County, Maryland. In Prince George's County, Maryland, a majority Black county, proposed hyperscale data center projects that sparked sustained opposition. That sustained opposition has now led to local officials to pausing permitting and creating task force to reconsider how these facilities are approved and monitored. Residents and activists argue that the county should pursue alternative, more inclusive development rather than ceding valuable land to massive tech infrastructure with uncertain local benefit. And finally, in South Carolina, policymakers and residents are sounding the alarm about secondary impacts of data centers on broader systems. In that state, proposed data center expansions and the power plants needed to feed them could delay the closure of fossil fuel generators and force the construction of new ones to meet skyrocketing electricity demands. And according to energy experts, the combined effect is that everyday households and residents, not tech companies, end up footing much of the capital costs for larger grids and generation capacity. In some rural mobile home communities, residents are already seeing utility bills rise by $40 to $50 per month, an increase that can be a serious burden in households where energy costs already make up a large share of monthly living expenses. And across these examples I've named, the pattern should be very clear by now. AI data centers place new strain on local power grids, sometimes delaying the retirement of fossil fuel plants instead of accelerating clean energy. They drive up utility costs for residents as everyday households absorb the cost of grid expansion. They consume massive amounts of water in regions already facing scarcity. They reshape land use, replacing community assets with industrial campuses that create few long-term jobs. And they add new air and public health risks in places already carrying environmental burdens. None of this is theoretical. These are all lived impacts. And in addition to these costs, there's also the employment myth, because after the initial construction boom, many data centers generate very few permanent jobs, sometimes just dozens, relative to the long-term scale of land use and community impact. Meanwhile, local governments are repeatedly asked by tech companies to offer tax breaks, zoning variances, and subsidies as if permanent employment is guaranteed. So when Black communities raise these concerns, they're not just being anti-technology. It's an honest and evidence-based assessment of cost versus benefit. So understanding these real living examples is essential before we move on to the next part of the episode. Microsoft's Community First announcement. Part 3. Why Microsoft announced a community first approach and what it does and does not solve. So against this backdrop we just discussed, Microsoft's January 2026 announcement matters. Not because it represents a sudden or radical shift in corporate values, but because it reflects a response to sustained public pressure. So for the first time, in a very visible way, Microsoft acknowledged something communities had already been articulating for months. Public trust around AI data centers is strained. Opposition was no longer isolated to a handful of neighborhoods or advocacy groups. It had become organized, increasingly coordinated, and tied to broader concerns about environmental justice, structure strain, and local decision-making power. All the things that SZA discussed in her July 2025 tweet. So in response, naturally, Microsoft announced what it described as a community-first approach to building AI data centers. And as a part of that approach, the company outlined several commitments, including covering electricity costs so data centers do not raise consumer utility bills, working with utilities to expand power supply rather than straining existing grids, reducing water use and replenishing more water than it consumes, investing in local construction and operations training, expanding AI education efforts, and notably avoiding requests for property tax breaks. So again, on paper, this all sounds like progress. And in a narrow sense, it kind of is, because these commitments directly respond to some of the most common concerns raised by communities. In making these pledges, Microsoft is acknowledging that the costs associated with AI infrastructure are real and that they cannot automatically be passed on to surrounding communities. So I will say that acknowledgement matters. But to fully understand the significance of this announcement, it's important to be clear about why it happened. It did not occur because Microsoft newly embraced environmental justice as a guiding principle, okay? It did not occur because the tech industry broadly re-examined its relationship to local communities. It occurred because communities organized, asked specific questions, pushed back against vague promises of economic benefit, and demanded clearer terms. This is important because it reveals where leverage actually exists. So, in my opinion, Microsoft announcement shows that when opposition becomes sustained, coordinated, and politically visible, even large technology companies can be pressured to adjust their approach. Not necessarily by changing their underlying structure, which we will talk about in a second, but by changing how they engage, what they promise, and what they are willing to absorb financially. And that brings us to another critical question. What does this announcement actually address, and what does it leave unresolved? So, at a minimum, Microsoft announcement helps establish a baseline expectation. AI centers should not increase local utility bills. Energy and water demand should be planned for in advance, and communities should not be asked to subsidize private infrastructure through tax giveaways. And this matters because it demonstrates something communities are often told is unrealistic, that these costs can, in fact, be absorbed by the companies building the facilities. So, in that sense, Microsoft's approach becomes a reference point. By no means are they doing us any favors, but it does set a precedent that other companies can be measured against. Now, what this announcement does not do is create enforceable standards. We have to remember these commitments are only voluntary. They are not embedded in law. They are not uniformly applied across projects. They do not automatically extend to every community where data centers are proposed. There are no clear mechanisms for independent oversight, long-term monitoring of energy and water use, or enforcement if commitments are later reduced or revised. And most importantly, the announcement does not fundamentally change who controls the decision-making process. Communities are still responding to projects after sites are selected rather than shaping proposals from the beginning. Negotiations still occur late in the process, and protections remain uneven, and is more likely to occur where resistance is organized and visible, and less likely where communities lack resources or political access. So while the tone has shifted, the underlying structure largely has not. And again, that distinction matters because voluntary commitments are not the same as accountability, and precedent is not the same as protection. So what the Microsoft announcement ultimately shows is not that the problem has been solved, but that pressure can change some of these outcomes. Which brings us to our next question. If this type of leverage exists, how do Black communities use it before harm occurs? That's what we'll turn to next. Part 4, what Black communities can do right now, turning awareness into leverage. So, what can Black communities actually do right now in the real political and legal landscape where these decisions are being made? The answer is earlier intervention, clearer demands, and shifting who bears the cost. Here's what that looks like in practice. First, get involved before a project is framed as inevitable. By the time construction equipment appears, the key decisions have usually already been made. Most data center approvals happen quietly during zoning changes, land use amendments, utility coordination, and infrastructure planning, often long before a public-facing announcement happens. Planning commissions, zoning boards, and utility regulators make decisions months or even years before communities are told a project is coming. That means showing up early matters. And practically, that looks like paying attention to zoning boards and planning commission agendas, tracking requests for land zoning or industrial use permits, and asking early questions about electricity demand, water access, and grid upgrades. Once a project is presented as a done deal, public input can then become symbolic. So early engagement is where leverage actually exists. Second, ask for written commitments, not reassurances. Communities should not rely on town halls, press releases, or verbal promises. If a project is going to reshape local infrastructure, residents are entitled to written public disclosures that explain the impact. That includes how much electricity the facility will require and how the grid will be expanded, how much water it will consume over time, not just at the launch, what cooling systems will be used, and what trade offs they involve. What's the expected noise, traffic, and land use impacts? And are there any backup power plans in emergency scenarios? If a company cannot clearly document how much it will take and from where, the risk will be shifted onto the community. And those documents should be public anyhow. So for me, companies providing transparency is not necessarily doing us any favors. To me, it is a condition of responsible development. Third, don't trade tax breaks for vague promises. One of the most consistent patterns in data center development is this. Local governments offer tax incentives in exchange for promised economic growth, and later they discover that permanent job creation is minimal. So, in my opinion, communities should push for a clear standard. No tax breaks without enforceable guarantees. For me, that means permanent job commitments, not just short-term construction work. That means defining community investment requirements, defining penalties if commitments are not met. And also, ongoing reporting should just be a standard. So basically what I'm saying is if the economic benefits are real, they should withstand scrutiny. And if they don't, communities should not be asked to subsidize them. Fourth, use Microsoft's commitment as leverage, not as an applause. So Microsoft's Community First announcement, it matters, right? But not because it deserves some level of praise for doing what they should be doing in the first place. It matters because it establishes a reference point. Because now communities can reasonably ask, one, if Microsoft can absorb electricity costs, why can't this AI company? Two, if Microsoft can't avoid tax abatements, why are we being asked to offer them from this AI company? And three, if Microsoft can plan for water replenishment, why is that considered unrealistic with this AI company? So the goal is not to celebrate one company for doing what they should be doing in the first place. The goal is to raise the baseline expectation for all of them. And fifth, if possible, organize beyond city lines because data centers do. Data centers rarely appear in isolation. They cluster by region, utility access, and infrastructure corridors. That means community responses should do the same. When communities act alone, opposition can be dismissed as local resistance. When regions coordinate across cities, counties, and utility districts, standards begin to form. This is how voluntary commitments become industry expectations and eventually, and hopefully, public policy. Well, guys, that's it for this episode. Today, I hope you were able to actually learn that AI data centers are not neutral infrastructure. They come with real costs, and right now, those costs are being concentrated in Black communities, often without consent, transparency, or long-term benefit. Microsoft's announcement shows something important here, though, that pressure works. Knowledge works. But let's be clear about something real quick. This announcement is still only words. They're only promises. These are commitments we haven't seen fully tested yet. Whether this becomes meaningful change depends on what Microsoft actually does next and whether communities are able to hold this company to these standards over time. The real work now is staying engaged long after the press release. And this is exactly why this conversation doesn't end here. We'll continue tracking how these commitments show up in practice and whether the actions actually match the words. And if you would like to stay in this conversation, follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as my work on social media. All links will be provided in the description. So always remember, technology may have been miseducated, but you do not have to be. So let's learn, let's grow, and let's thrive together. I'll see you next week on the Miseducation of Technology podcast.